Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? There we go. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to introduce Alan Lacer, is going to be our turner tonight. He's going to talk to us about how to use the Skew safely and efficiently.
This one?
That one. That's a Skew,
Wait,
folks.
I've got a bigger one.
I want to see him turn with this
So
one.
I got a bigger one too, so.
I'll leave it to him, Alan Lacer.
Okay. Well, it's good to be back in Baja, Oklahoma. Oh, you don't call this Baja, Oklahoma? Hey, I left the OU hat in my van, so I didn't go over the top this time. I usually do, but, well, anyway, been doing this a long time. I think the first demo I ever did outside of Oklahoma was in Carrollton in the early 80s at a Paxton store. Anybody remember that? Yeah, so since then, this is my year 41 of turning. So I've done all 50 states and about 8 or 9 foreign countries, and I figure I'm working on my second million miles of wood turning driving. And I just drove 1,300 miles to get here, and you know what? It was all good except the last 20. I love that. Welcome to Dallas. I thought, LA isn't much worse than what you've got here, so sorry I made that, but hopefully that's the end of it. Well, anyway, been doing this quite a while, doing the wood turning, and do a lot of teaching and writing of it, and it takes me all over. So they gave me a little over an hour to talk about this marvelous tool. Sorby a few years ago came out with their Texas series of tools, and believe it or not, they did have a Skew, and it was on a closeout table at a conference. Nobody wanted it, and I said, that's my tool. But I put my grind on it. It's a little different from what it first looked like. So that was their Texas series of tools. English making Texas tools. I think there's something fishy going on with that. But I can use it. It's not a big deal. So the Skew chisel, to do an hour on it is it's a little tough. I teach a class now. It's a week-long class where the only tool you get to use is this. Started as a 2-day class and did it for years. And the students it's a place I teach in Indiana, Mark Adams School, and they said, we need more time. We're just starting to understand it. So this will be the 3rd year of a week-long class. And last time I did it, they went to Mark and said, this could be a 2-week class. So you've given me 1 hour to talk about this tool, and I assume a lot of you hate it. Is that a fair assessment? Anybody afraid of it? Scared. There's the word. At least you're honest Texans. I like honest Texans. Okay. But there's a lot to this little tool. It looks like just a little flat piece of metal, but it's gotten to go to some very smart people. I can promise you that. It's got a long learning curve, and that's why people don't want to pay the price. I've got a friend, a master in Switzerland, and I've been over to his shop a couple of times, and he takes apprentices. It's a 4-year apprenticeship program to become a wood turner. Germany's only 3 years. The Swiss do it 4 years. And he told me what he does the first 3 months. They're employed. He has to make money. I mean, this isn't because he's generous to people. He needs them to make money. He gives them a Skew chisel, and that's the only tool they get for the first 3 months. And he says they go crazy. Then they get it or they quit. Nah. And then he hands them gouges, and they go, what are these things? They're sure easy. And so it turns out, he said that was the fastest way he could bring somebody up to do wood turning. Now, he does architectural turning. He's not doing bowl turning or anything. Don't get it wrong. Because you don't really use this in bowl turning, face grain bowl turning on the outside of a bowl. But it is a tough teacher. It's going to make you put in a little bit of time. But if you do get it, you'll love it. That's the other thing that I hear from people all the time. They really love the tool. But it's got some quirky things about it. There's about a dozen cuts, and I think in an hour what I can do here is go over how you prepare the lathe to be more friendly, how to prepare the tool so it's more friendly, and I'll do maybe 4 or 5 cuts for you. Okay? I'll start with some simple ones, and I'll go to some harder ones. But there's a lot to this little piece of metal. There really is. And I use a little bit different grind than the traditional grind. I'll explain why I do this particular grind. So I've got the highway buzz. 1,300 miles, and I fought a headwind, I figure, for 1,000 miles of it, and it beat me to a pulp. So this is how I warm up. I started this, 25, 30 years ago was a warm-up, and then it turned out people wanted to buy them. And it turned out to be some of the best money I ever made in wood turning. If you looked at per hour, what you actually made per hour. Oh. Just a second. Oh, don't knock him up. Is that going to work? Can they see? Oh. Can you see? You can? Oh, there I am. I should have combed my hair, though. Look a little better. So to do this, I got to use 5 different cuts. The Skew is not a one-trick pony. There isn't one cut and you've got it. Now, even to do this simple thing, I'm going to use 5 different cuts. It was a peeling cut. This is a planing cut. Skew is one of the few tools you can come in from the air and it won't split the wood. Usually you're on a bigger scale, but it's kind of curious that this doesn't split the wood. Now there's going to be a rolling cut with a long point down. Whoop. I'm going to switch to a V cut and turn a little bead. And I'm going to use a V cut to put some lines in it as a detail. Okay? Now here's another rolling cut. Start with a big one here. Now I wonder how we're going to catch that. I need somebody who can reach in here and catch it. Could I get an arm through here? Long arm. Oh, I don't hurt people usually. Okay, you ready? Okay, you spin him in here. See if you'll spin. I'll do one more. Can you do it? Yeah. Do another little bead, smaller. You want to catch this one? I need my catcher. You ready?
In case that other one wasn't small enough for you.
Oh yeah, these are the big ones. Okay, you get him?
Yep. Can I grab it? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I gave you enough stem. Did he do it? Ooh, ooh. Well, this is a little one. You want to get this one? You ready?
Yes, sir.
There you go. Oh, don't lose it. It's the best one I ever made in my life. So I put them in here with their friends. Now, I've counted every one of these. So when it comes back, I'm going to recount them. I trust you Texans, but I got to be careful. Here, you want to pass that around? There's two myths with miniature work. You need little tools and a little lathe. Both are false. This lathe is far better than a mini lathe for doing miniature work. That big skew is far better than a 1/4-inch skew. That doesn't make sense. Why does it not make sense? Why is that bigger skew better for little work? Stable, the stability. I get much more control with that bigger tool. Now, when you hollow, you need to have little bitty tools, like we used dental tools, concrete nails. We ground in a little round nose. When I started, a lot of well-known turners did miniature work, and it's kind of disappeared, and it's really a sad thing because it's a great way to develop dexterity and control. And believe it or not, I use it to relax because I can't do that if I'm tense driving through Dallas rush hour traffic. God. I thought I was going to have to phone you and say, I ain't going to make it. But I made it. Okay, let's talk about it, about the Skew chisel. Can you hear it? Okay. All right. Okay. I got my interchangeable tools here. Okay, that's a Skew chisel. Probably one of the very first turning tools because it's easy to make. A gouge is a little harder to make, but a skew is not hard to make. Why do you think they don't have square across chisels? I don't think you find a square across chisel sold by anyone. Now, if they do scrapers, I'm not talking about scrapers. I'm talking about a chisel that's beveled on two sides. Anybody know why? You probably aren't going to see it. Well, I got 2 points here. Okay. I got a newsletter from a California group. They said the secret to the skew is grind off the points. You just wiped out 7 of my favorite cuts. I think there's some confusion about that. No, a straight across chisel is a wicked tool to use. You're going to get more runbacks and dig-ins both. And I'll explain what both of those phenomena are. With this cutaway, it's a clearance angle. It clears away from the wood, but when I was doing that top, I could look right over the top and do the finest. Without that, I'd have to move my head over here to look. So it's also a viewing angle. And there's a number of cuts we do it with. It's called the long point down. Okay? So this angle is not arbitrary. If it's too skewed, is that a word? Too skewed? I think it is. I'll make it up. You don't want 45 or 50. Sears and Crown used to sell theirs around 50 degrees. That's a wicked, wicked tool. If you have very little clearance, it's a wicked tool for other reasons. So here's kind of a starting point. About 70 degrees from point to point is a good baseline. So take off 90 from a 90 and you're in the ballpark. You can be 2 or 3 degrees either side. It's going to be okay. But that is important to have skewness, but not too much nor too little. This is Goldilocks. Okay? Another important angle is this, where the two ground surfaces crisscross. That's called an included angle. What should it be? I don't go by an angle. What I do is measure the thickness of the steel, multiply it times 1.5. Tells me how far back to grind it. It's the same thing. But everybody can measure the thickness. Again, it does not have to be precisely there. Too short of a bevel, it's hard to find your bevel. You'll lose your bevel more often. And you don't get a very sharp tool if it's like a splitting wedge. It's not going to slice the wood. It's going to bulldoze the wood off. If I get too low of an angle, like a straight razor, it's too flimsy to do wood turning. And when you grind it on a grinder, it'll burn away. It'll feather on you, it's called. Okay? So that 1.5 is splitting the differences between two extremes. Another thing that I do to my skews, this is the long point, and that's the short point. Very important, because in one cut, the long point's your friend. The next cut, it'll kill you. So you need to understand these things. Okay? Behind the short point, I do a full round. Absolutely rounded completely. Behind the long point, I want a flat, but I want the corners broken off. However you get there. It's not done on a wheel grinder. That's not a very good way to do it. A belt grinder, which is a belt sander with a metal cutting belt, will do it very nicely. Some skews now come with that, but not all of them, traditional ones. What I don't like is the oval skew. I have no use for the oval skew. Matter of fact, I buy them back from people. It's called my cash for clunker skews. I pay $4 for an oval skew. I'm trying to get them out of all the shops in America. You can't believe how many I have. Because when I say that, I have to follow through, don't I? Okay. But I'm not a fan of the oval skew. And we can go into it, but not tonight probably. But it's not one of my favorite tools. Sharpening it, you've got two different grinds. This is a traditional grind. This is by far the easiest to sharpen. All I've got to really do, if this is a grinding wheel, get the edge parallel to the face and just move it back and forth. Don't angle it. You're going to get a goofy grind on the thing. But just parallel the face. It's just like a big parting tool at that point. Okay? I'm going to come around there to my grinder. Got a magic marker. Yep. Oh, I will. Let's see here. Just kind of angle him. Be careful. It'll fall on your foot. You'll be late to the dance. Oh, you want to go that far?
Tell me when.
It's for me. It's the camera guy that's...
You okay?
Okay. And can you plug it in for me? It is plugged in. Okay, does it work? Okay, if you got a traditional skew, set the angle with the grinder off. It's running, but we'll pretend. And just go back and forth like this. Very simple to grind. Very, very simple to grind. I don't really use this grind. I use one that's a little more challenging to grind. That's the only downside. It's got about 7 advantages over a traditional grind. Only downside is a little harder to sharpen. Not hard to sharpen at all. There's no grinding jig on the market, so forget about a grinding jig. You don't need grinding jigs, even for your bowl gouges. Is that a sacrilegious thing to say in Texas? I like you already. I just met you. It's better to know, to not ever be told that. If you just do it, you go, well, what's the big deal? If you just follow the bouncing ball and how to use it. But, no, I teach a lot of beginning classes and things. I never teach grinding jigs. God, he's a mean guy. I don't let him use grinding jigs. Yeah, why not? Why do you hate them? I dislike them. She says she hates them. Yeah? Mm-hmm. There you go. Okay. Well, here's why I don't teach it. If somebody needs to be taught, and there's people who need them. Okay, don't get me wrong. I don't give you an F in a class if you got to use a grinding jig for your bowl gouge or something. But I find by Thursday, you have a group of beginners, many have never told a turn before or ground tools. They're using all the tools freehand. I call this freehand grinding. I'm using a platform, okay? That's not really a jig. Other than an angle, and on some tools, it has no value at all. Here's why I do it. When I take a turning tool at the grinder, I take a turning tool, put it on a tool rest, I rub my bevel, I manipulate the edge, I've got a round form coming down to meet the tool. Oh, I'm sorry. Right here? So remember what I just said. When I come to the grinder, I've got a wood turning tool. I'm putting it on a tool rest. I've got a round object coming down to meet my tool. I'm rubbing the bevel and I'm manipulating the edge. What does that sound like? That's wood turning, isn't it? So what is that a definition of? Turning or grinding? Well, it is. It's the same. The only difference is the round object over here removes the tool, and over there, the tool removes the round object. But the skill you develop at the grinder will transfer 100% to the lathe, and the skill you develop there. You don't have a jig over there. If you did, it would be called wood machining. I've had machinists who'd worked on metal lathes most of their life struggle when they came to wood turning. Why? It's still turning. No, it's machining. There's a huge difference. You don't have a jig over there. So my theory is, why don't you just learn to use it the way you're going to have to over at the lathe? And you can't hurt your tools. You got to get over the idea you're going to hurt the tool. All you can do is shorten them. And in the trade, that was called tool tuition, and everybody's paid it. Don't let anybody kid you, they didn't pay tool tuition. But that's part of learning. So that's a good place to go to. Do you have Harbor Freight? Some of you probably have your tools from there. That's okay. Used to be a $44 set. Now it's up to $80. You get 8 tools, but turn them into powder. You will learn how to sharpen tools. Okay? If you're afraid of hurting, but you can't hurt these tools. You can't hurt them. There's nothing you could do that I couldn't fix. I might have to reduce the length a little, but that's part of learning. Okay? So get over it. This one, you can't hurt the tool. And you use it as feedback. If you're afraid to do it with an expensive Skew chisel, get a $5 Skew chisel, or go to flea markets and get the old junk tools. The Sears, they won't even reach the wheel, though. They didn't give you enough steel to begin with. But they make little platforms. And just turn them into powder. You cannot hurt them. There's nothing you can do to hurt the tool, so get over it. Huh? Have I ever hurt you? No, but he's hurt some people. That's why the Federal Trade Commission makes me put this now on all my tools, my Skews. What do we have there? Skull and crossbones. That's because it's hurt people. No, it hasn't. That's a lie. Don't let anybody kid you. Okay, so sharpen it like this. It's got a straight and then a curve. This isn't a radius skew. I hate a radius skew. It's actually got a straight section at the long point, and 1/3 to 1/4 length, then it becomes a curve. 70 degrees from point to point, 1.5 times the thickness, come back, etc. Full round, broken corners. Everything else is exactly the same. So when you sharpen this, here's how you do it. Okay, so that's the same on both sides. You got to flip it over. When a tool comes new, the cutting edge is probably not in the middle. The way I do that, I keep alternating. One downside to these CBM wheels, there's no spark trail. Spark trail is what I use to tell me when to quit grinding. Everybody raves about these like it's a religious experience. No, they've got pluses and minuses like everything else. I like the width. I like the fact the radius stays the same and it's always flat. But loss of a spark trail is a big deal. It really is. If you really want to learn to fine grind, you need sparks. Sorry. So, but the magic marker told me I was there. That's all I did, just the straight section. Now here's what makes it more difficult. I use a fist on the big one. And I fan it. Stop when that's more or less horizontal and just fan it back. Okay, and that's it. Now, ceramic wheel is really good for roughing. So what I set up to do very often is a ceramic wheel, because this is called a coarse, which is a joke. It's not coarse at all. It's a 60/80, and that's what I do my finish grinding on. But if I have to rough a tool, you'd be here all night trying to rough a tool on these. And I doubt if anybody has one that grit. So this is a 46, 3X Norton, cheap import wheel. They're okay. But for a roughing wheel, it's very good. But finish grind on that, okay? Now, it's sharp, but it's not scary sharp. This is Woodturners sharp. I'm sorry, Woodturners. A lot of you don't know what a sharp tool is. And this is the way most people use their tools. They just take them off a grinder. That's not sharp enough, not for a skew. Have you ever used a bandsaw or a chainsaw that's just a little bit dull? What's it like? Can you cut a straight line on a bandsaw? Superman can't hardly do it. No, the skew's the same way. It'll behave in direct proportion how sharp you get it. Okay, so we got to take it another level. This is just a starting point. Okay, true of my bowl gouges and everything too. I never use them off the grinder unless I'm roughing. I mean, there's a place for a rough grind, but if you want a tool for finer work, you're going to need to do more to it. So let's back up for a minute. How do you know when you go to your shop and you pick up a tool, here's even a bowl gouge, how do I know whether I can put this onto the wood, I need to grind it, or I need to hone it? How would I know that? Spin this. I like you. I like that. Keep an eye on her. She's thinking, but I like that. Well, the best tests are actually while it's turning, but I can't always fire up the machine. What if it's a rough bowl blank? It's not going to work. I need some bench test, okay? So for all the cutting tools, there's all kinds of bench tests. This is the one I find people for. If I catch them feeling the edge, I charge 25 cents if I see anybody doing that. 25 cents. I don't know what that tells you, to be honest with you. This is tissue paper. This poplar I have is 10 times harder to cut cleanly than this stuff. This stuff is nothing for this kind of edge. The fingernail test, you're not going to run that whole edge along your fingernail. And I had a doctor in a class said, you know what, you could open up the fingernail for fungal infection. It'll be buying those products they sell at football games, right, on TV. The funniest one I heard, a carver told me, they said, take your tool, cut into your thumb, and if it doesn't hurt but bleeds, that's sharp. I thought, no. And one of my favorites, of course, is shaving. Yeah, whenever, see if I brought it. I don't know if I even brought my, yeah. So when I meet a shaver, I bring out my roughing gouge. And I say, here, why don't you shave with that? I stop them. Anybody know what would happen if you tried to shave with a gouge? It'll gouge. It'll cut a trough. It won't shave. So none of those are very good. I'm sorry. They're not very good indicators. No, there's only one thing that I can use as a bench test, and that is like this. What color does that appear to be? Hold still. I'm bad about not holding still. What color does it look to be? It's not. The steel is silver steel. It's even called that in Europe. It's called silver steel. There's no black on the steel at all. These are box knife blades. If you put enough box knife blades together, you create what is called a light trap in optics. And the theory says not only will it not reflect light, it actually absorbs light. So to me, this is a reverse flashlight. And no matter which way I point it, it appears black because of what it's doing to light. Well, when I started, the old carver, I started as a carver, his mantra was, put your edge into the light. If you can see the edge, you don't have an edge. And at first I thought, what is he even talking about? See the edge. What you're looking for, you can't see sharpness, but you know what you can see? Dullness. Anywhere that is white is light being bounced. You need good light. These are okay, but an incandescent or even one of the newer bulbs will work. LEDs or sunlight. But if you can get it, and no matter which way you turn it, if it totally appears black all the way across, that's a starting point. That's a starting point. I can still get it sharper than that, but if you don't pass that test, don't put it on the wood. Either grind it or hone it. Okay? So to get this really sharp after grinding, I'm going to use a hone. Now, with a Skew chisel, I don't think I brought one, you can use a flat hone. A flat hone. This is a slipstone. It's got two curves on it so you can hone the inside of a gouge. But you could use a flat hone on a Skew chisel. And the way you hone, it's a skill. You need to hone with only 2 products on the market will hone this steel. This is a super high wear steel, M4. Even M2 high-speed steel, which almost all your high-speed steel tools are made from, have particles in that are harder than your hard Arkansas. Small percentage, but it would take you a long time to hone with traditional hones. So you need to hone with either diamond or CBN, okay? And the way you hone, as a carver, we put our stones down. And I got around serious turners. They didn't put the stone down. They got steady with the tool. They moved the hone. Totally different concept of honing. And what I'm using is the hollow grind to function as a jig. I am using a jig. Because when I have a 2-point contact over a concave, what I did, I transferred the radius of the wheel. That's honing. I just see I don't see anything. Wait, I just appeared. Hold the show, hold the show. Come on. What are we doing this messing around with this little crap? You didn't know I had one like this. Yeah, it is. That's a hone. That's a skew. So what you do, you always start on the back. You're not doing anything. Oh, yes, you are. You know what? The last thing the wood sees is the back of the bevel. Woodturners meet this when they hollow and it cuts the wood. You don't know what did that. It wasn't the edge. It's the back of the bevel. Same with the skew. I want to soften this. So believe it or not, the setup is you're softening the back of the bevel. Now when you're ready, you tip forward and have a 2-point contact. You never come off the back of the bevel. If you come off the back of the bevel for 1 or 2 strokes like that, you'll roll your edge. Tool will be duller, not sharper. I've even had professionals tell me when they hone their tools, they're worse. No, that's not what honing is supposed to be about. It's supposed to make it better. It makes it better. So it doesn't take very long. You work one side. You work the other long side. I do 5 cuts with a long point, so I'll hone like that. 2 cuts with a short point, so I'll hone like that, and I'm done. People say, well, I don't need an edge that sharp. Well, they're forgetting something. It maintains the edge. I watched a professional bowl turner at a conference a few years ago. They asked him in the audience, do you hone your tools? His no, it's a waste of time. I watched him go to the grinder, put a jig on his bowl gouge, and he did that 3 to 4 times on one bowl. And I thought, that's interesting. I would have honed every time he went to the grinder, and I have a sharper tool. So who's wasting time at this point? When I started, everybody honed their tools. If you told Bob Stocksdale, Rudy Osonic, Dale Stubbs, don't hone your tools, they'd laugh you out of the room. Like, what do you know that I don't know? You wouldn't get very far with those 3. And then when steel changed, the hones no longer worked, and I used to watch demonstrators make fun of honing. You take your Grandpappy's hard Arkansas, I can promise you there's things much harder than a hard Arkansas in here, in the steel. And that's why, if you got enough time, you can do it. So you need to go to either CBN or Diamond. Diamond and CBN will cut everything on the market. Okay, so we got him sharp. Let's get the lathe prepared. This tool rest, I looked at this. This is very nice. It has a hardened rod, but it still had a couple of little nicks in it that I wanted to hit with a file. He puts a very hard rod on this, but the high points of the nicks came off. Then the other thing I do is take some paraffin and wax it. And what I'm after is 0 gravity. See that? Because this tool is a sports car. It's not a dump truck. It doesn't lumber along. Matter of fact, one of the hardest cuts with it, you got to move it very quickly, the rotation. If it stutters, you're going to have trouble. Okay? So very important that the tool rest be clean. Now, I heard some of you say you're afraid of the skew. Is that true? You can tell me. I won't tell anybody. So have you ever had a dig in? Anybody ever dig in with a skew? How was it? Was it fun? Rattle you? Did you just keep coming back? No. After about the 3rd time, you look like somebody trying to put cheese on a set mousetrap. I don't think you're going to do it. You're going to go, I hate you. I hate grinding jigs, and I hate you. So we're coming along. Let's slow it down. Not that much. There's a dig in. You know what? So what? It doesn't taste good. So just get it out of your system. Thank you, Lord, and they pay me to do this too. See if you can, not anymore, see if you can make your living doing stupid stuff. No. Here's what I'm doing. I don't use a spur center in my shop. I haven't used a spur center in years. Two of the best between center turners I ever knew in my life, they didn't use a spur center. They used the same thing I am. Now, I think they're two of the best lathes in the planet, robust out of Wisconsin. In one way, they only sell their lathes with these centers. They don't sell them with spurs. Oh, they'll sell you a spur if you want one, but once you understand this, you won't want a spur. And what it does, it takes all the sting out of it when you're learning the skew, because I can't do this with a spur. I can control the amount of drive by how tight I wind this. See, let me move this so I don't get my hand in there. See, I can just stop it and give it a little more. Hard to stop. If I'm making my living out of it, there we go. Now, if I get a bad dig in, it'll still just blow through, and it can't pitch it off the machine. So I work with little kids. I've worked with kids as young as 3.5 years old. I wouldn't put a 3.5-year-old on a drill press, but I'll put them on a wood lathe. It's the only machine you hold onto the cutter and you're pushing it away from you, and with these kind of centers. I worked a lot with 8 to 10-year-olds, and they learn they never touch this. I touch this. That determines how much drive. But when you're learning something like the skew, you don't want to wreck your nerves. Matter of fact, I have people practice dig-ins to understand it, and if you understand a dig-in, you won't get dig-ins, okay? Runbacks are another critter. We'll talk about those too, but I did have a skew. Here it is. But I mean, you can get plenty of drive from it. Well, I'm really driving it right. There, but it'll still hear that sound. It's stopping the piece. That tastes good. One way he had seen Dale Stubbs and myself, we learned it from the same guy, an old turner. And somebody broke their nose on a one-way machine many years ago. Not a serious accident as far as accidents go on the lathe. Believe me, that's minor. And they're rare. Accidents are still rare on a wood lathe. And what happens with a spur center, you bop it just right, it'll climb. It climbs out of the 4 prongs, and it'll pitch it off the lathe. And that's what happened. It came around and broke the guy's nose. So the owner had seen us doing that. From then on, he supplied him with this. Call it a safety drive. They make it sound like it's for baby wood turners. It is. It's also for seasoned wood turners, but I modify mine. Not this one. Mine's modified that I use. Let's see if we can zoom in on that. Can you get at the spindle? Ooh, that's beautiful. See, this one is the way they come. See, it's just a smooth rim. And when you're learning, leave them like that. Once you develop your sea legs a little bit, take out the pin. Well, it's in the lathe now. Well, you can sharpen this rim with a file, a mill file, fine cut mill file, because you want that sharp. You want to drive that into the wood. But to have it drive in woods like Osage orange, hard maple, cocobolo, I take a chainsaw file and I cut 3 little notches. Turns out 3's enough. And it'll drive any of those woods. No problem. Hold still. I know it. I've been known to wear out bearings on camera stands. Can you see them? Does it show up? Now, will I get this back if I pass it around? No, okay. Like I said, they're honest Texans. They're honest. I like that about them. But with kids, there's no question. There's no question. And in some places I teach, this is all I let people use. But don't think it's just for beginners. It's really not. It has other advantages, too. You can take things on and off the lathe, and guess what? It's always centered. And when I turn handles, I turn a lot of handles, I take them off and feel them. I don't just turn them, say, a masterpiece. That's not how it works, folks. You have to size it and feel it. Or I'll do a run of something. And I know you're not production turners, but you can also load and unload with the lathe running. See, there's nothing to bite. So I'll tell it, now let's go. Then you can take things off and on and off, and it's safe. That's not unsafe. It's really not. It is with a spur. You'd wreck your hands. But that's the smallest part. The thing that it's always centered is a big plus, and for beginners and learning the skew chisel. Okay, let's do some cuts here. You can, I'll turn it off to load it. That's a bad habit to show you. You can rough with a skew chisel. Now after the skew chisel, I love this tool. I love that, spindle roughing gouge. This is a good size to do everything from porch columns to ink pens, even an ink pen, because the bigger it is, the better it is at leveling. You'd think it's the opposite. No, you need a little bitty one for ink pens. No, you don't. It'll want to surf. Try to cut a straight line. No, it won't. The bigger it is, so don't let the scale throw you with wood turning tools. It matters in carving, where the shape is often dictated by the shape of the tool. That's not how we do it over here. Okay? But if I have short pieces, usually under a foot and usually under 3 inches square, I'll rough with my skew chisel. Especially if I'm going to do some skew work, I'll just rough with a skew. And I'm going to show you 2 ways to rough it. I'm going to do half of it by planing off the corners, half of it peeling. Okay? And the wood will often dictate which one works. Okay, here's planing. I'm setting up like this. It's not flat on the rest. Can you see that? It's not flat on the rest. It's up on a corner. I'm just going to push. I'll do it slow. I just push off the corners. Up to speed, I can do it in one push a lot of times. The corners won't hit you because you're pushing them away from you. See that, how nice that is? Just push them off like that. Then I would turn and go this way. There's a downside to that. Didn't do it. No, it did a little bit out here at the end state. It has a riving action or a riving action. In some woods that are figured, the corners will take part of the cylinder if you're not careful. Like I love Osage orange. That's what the tops were made from, Osage orange, one of my favorite woods. It doesn't like the skew planing on it because the wood is changing direction all the time. It's a beast to try to carve it or anything. So I wouldn't take off the corners using that technique, or a figured wood like cocobolo or something, or even red oak is bad about. So we would take them off by peeling. This is peeling, totally different animal. Handle is way down. I got the tool almost vertical. Hand on top. Now, it's not going to be as nice a surface, but there's zero chip out. It's fuzzy. It's a pencil sharpener cut. See, it looks like something that came out of a pencil sharpener. It's a roughing cut, but for taking off the corners. You can also use it to remove stock very rapidly. Okay? That's a peeling cut. It's a wasting cut. But often we use it for removing the corners, but it is flat on the rest. It's like a big parting tool. Now here's already an advantage. If I have a traditional skew, where did I leave that traditional skew? Stuck in the ceiling. No, it's not. Here's one. This is an old guy. If I peel with it and I try to use the whole edge, it'll overpower it, and you can't. You find out you got to use half of it or a third of it. And also look where the handle has to go. Handle has to cock over to one side like that, or it's cocked over here. You see, I'm using too much of the edge. It's telling me I got to use less. See, I have to use less. This grind, it's self-limiting. You can't use too much of it. And the handle's straight. A minor cut, but it's still helpful. It's a helpful cut to move wood away. It's one of the reasons I don't like the oval skew. You can't virtually do that cut with an oval skew. So roughing with a skew, planing, and peeling. Now, when I first started, this was the only cut really described, was the true planing cut. A lot of the cuts with a skew are finishing cuts, and I'll show you why. Kind of abused him here a little. And when you hone, it's almost always under 30 seconds is all it takes. If I have to hone, it takes more than a minute. I need to be at a grinder. So don't let anybody tell you it's a waste of time. You got to sit down, chant a mantra, and just do this and do this. No, it's very quick. It's like a cold swim in and off. So here's the planing cut. Sorry, don't need that kind of speed. Got a nice knot there. That's nice. An underhand grip it is. It's not like a fence. It's just really this, those cheap Wisconsin life centers. Sorry. No, I didn't hurt him. He's got to be tougher than that. There we go. Okay. What kind of finish is that? You ready? What do we get? Let me see it again. Let me see it again here. Yeah. Well, a lot of the cuts are finished cuts. 100 years ago, this was sandpaper and long grain turning. Even if you'd done everything with a gouge, come back and clean up and finish off with a skew. And should be able to get a finish like that pretty easily. It was chippy because I have, there's kind of a knot or an old branch in that or something, so I had to hit it again one more time. But you can even turn a knot. You can turn a knot where there's zero chip out using that technique with it. So here's what it looks like. Let me remove my corners. So to arrest, and I'm up. I'm using an underhand grip now, roughing off and using overhand. But for underhand grip, that's why the British call this a hand rest. Bolt turners don't need a hand rest. They need a fulcrum. For underhand grips in this kind of turning, we use underhand grips all the time on detailed gouges and skews. Rub your bevel. And usually take a pretty light cut if you're finishing. And play with this angle right here is how we deal with chippy wood. We can play with this angle. Okay? The wood will tell you what it wants to do, how it wants to be cut. Looks like a simple cut, but there's a couple of problems. This is the most common problem. That, or if you're going this way, it'll go that way, or it happens as soon as you touch the wood. Now, that's not a dig-in. Some people call that a dig-in too. That's not a dig-in. That's a run-back, a skate, or a screw thread. Okay? If you brought in one of these art turners, that I think you got a couple up here anyway, they would call this surface design. Surface decoration. Yeah, isn't that pretty? See what it does? Isn't that pretty? That's kind of cool, see? Yeah, Aggie yard. I like that. I like that. That's more common than the dig-in, by far, is the run-back. And bolt turners get it too when they try to enter a bowl, or down deep inside when you're trying to go through dead man's curve. If you get a run back there, it throws the tool into the inner wall, the trailing edge hits, and that's a classic dig-in, and that's drama in wood turning. With that in it? So what you want to do is learn to control dig-ins and run-backs out here, not inside a bowl. That's not the place to learn it. Unfortunately, there's nothing in bowl turning like my slipping center. You're going to get the full horsepower a lot of times. So what caused it? Some of you that are pretty new to turning, what do you think I do? Let's clean it off now. I got a mess. Slow down. To get that, I'm doing it real controlled. But if it happens as soon as you come up here, it's not very controlled. It'll scare you. So what's going on? The lady who hates grinding jigs. What's causing it? Okay. That's not a bad way to put it. There you go. I knew she would get it. I knew she would get it. No, it has to do with the bevel. And if I did the same moves with my roughing gouge, you know what it would do? It'd just keep going. It's very hard to get a run back or a dig in with one of these. This tool I start everybody on. Usually it's new to wood turning, even little kids or adults. Not a bowl turning tool. You'll break them right here. Don't anybody kid you about that. I carry one around with me that's sheared off. Somebody snapped it in bowl turning. They're not for bowl turning. Oh, you do whatever you want in your own shop, and I'll tell you, don't let anybody convince you of that. There's one demonstrator who goes around, he's welded a round bar into his roughing gouge, into the handle. First off, it's very hard to weld high-speed steel, and you're not going to go do it. And you're going to get into serious trouble with it someday, and you're either going to bend it or snap it off. So it's not for face grain bowl turning. Got its name roughing gouge because it's great to take off the corners in long grain work. That's where it's to be used. But what my point is, if I had lost my bevel for a little bit with this, I'm in a scraping angle, and it would just keep going. The Skew doesn't allow that. You go off the bevel for half a nanosecond, it'll spit it back. It'll spit it right back. Either you never had it, like this, here you never had it, or you had it and you lost it. So the thing to watch is this, but you can't watch it. You can't see it. You have to feel it. Because that angle is what's underneath the tool. It's like a door hinge. You start with the door closed. Rub the bevel. Raise it and stay there. If you raise it a few more degrees, it'll do that to you. So, but you can feel that in your hands. So you develop this habit. Always on the tool rest first. When steel contacts wood, no shavings, no ribbons, nothing. It's like being on base in baseball. Now engage the cut. You won't have that trouble. But this is the problem back here, and it's the angle you can't see. You're going to have to feel it. What terrifies people is the dig-in. I think I did some early on, didn't I? This is a dig-in. It has to do with points. The California group said grind off both points. I'm not sure they're right. But it does have something to do with points. So what would happen if I stuck the short point in the wood? Bad, good, or neutral? Good? I'm rubbing the bevel. I'm riding the bevel. So there, I'm on the bevel. So what happens if I jab that short point in the wood? Ugly? Huh? Hide the kids. Here we go. Ooh, you know what? That's not so bad. Ooh, 800 grit again. If you go too deep, though, it'll rag up the fibers. We use it, though, if I have a detail that I'm cutting to, I'll actually use the point to work right up to the detail like that with control. So don't be afraid of it. We just don't normally lead it into the cut. The trouble is the trailing part of the tool, never the leading part. That's true of bowl gouges and detail gouges. It's what's coming from behind. So here's the physics. Draw a line right through the middle of the tools, its axis. When I present it in planing, let's slip it. Planing mode, when I'm in the lower half of the axis, it's supported by the force of the lathe. Doesn't look like it, but that's what's holding it up there to work. It's just balancing on a single point here. The force of the lathe is supporting it. As I come across that, it progressively loses. It doesn't happen all at once. It progressively loses support. When you get into the upper 1/3 to 1/4, there, that's a classic dig-in. See, I didn't do that. That's physics. There, it just pulls it over. People who use spur centers say they caught the point, because that's the last thing they remember, right? Can you see it again? It's getting rickety. There, that's a classic dig-in. See what it's doing? Like that. If you do that with a dry hardwood and a spur center, it's got a kick to it. It'll scare you. You'll probably put it down and say, I don't like you. So dig-ins are to be avoided. But how do you avoid them? And don't say, don't use a Skew chisel. That's the incorrect answer. How do you avoid them? Does the size of the skew matter now for a dig-in? This is a 1/4 inch. Pretty good cut, but what's wrong with using a 1/4 inch wide skew to plane with? How much support do I have on the tool? How much is very little? Not enough? Maybe an eighth if I really push the envelope, but as soon as it crosses, ooh, do you see how diameter figures in now? What if I have a 10-inch bowl and I'm going to take my skew and plane? You know what? Just the tangent of hitting the bevel, raising the handle to engage may push it right into a dig-in immediately with violence in a bowl. So it's geometry a lot of times. Just don't use a skew on the outside of a bowl. Learn to use a bowl gouge that's swept back just a little bit. It's the same cut, but it's a lot friendlier. So the smaller the skew, the higher the risk of a dig-in, is what my point is. That's why I picked up this size to show you a dig-in. Because to get a dig-in with this size, I'd have to have gone on my toes or something weird. So rule of planing, use the biggest skew you got. How big is that? Anywhere from 1.25 to 1.5 is a nice window. Above 1.5, they're clumsy. Below 1.25, they're kind of neither fish nor fowl. I need 2 skews. I need a big one, I need a little one. There's a place for this one. So I don't need 10 skews, I need 2. My big one is 1.25 to 1.5, 1/2 to 5/8. I only have 1/4 inch skews to show you why I don't use them. Isn't that a reason to buy one? How are we doing on time? I'm supposed to... Are we doing okay? Thank you. I did? Ooh, I wish we had time. I will show you something. Oh, it's not a scraper. Yeah, but I will show you something about it. Here's some photographs. I did a study with crucible steel. These people invented powdered metal. Powdered metal is one of the biggest innovations of steel in 100 years. It happened in Syracuse, New York, believe it or not, late 60s, early 70s, where you turn the ingredients of steel into flour. And then they blow it through extremely high temperatures, put it into these giant casks under extreme pressure, and they were able to make alloys the world had never seen because nothing settles out. And the grains are so perfect, and it's such refinement. And so they had heard stories too, and I've had professionals tell me that some of the tools like Jerry Glazer developed and things, you can't get them sharp. You can't get them as sharp. So they had me do a whole series of studies with gouges and skews, and then later with scrapers, believe it or not. And what they had me do was prepare an edge and cut the wood with those different prepared edges and in different steels. So this is a skew chisel, what it looks like off a grinder at 200x. So what can you surmise from looking at that? So most people don't hone their tools, and this is what their bowl gouges look like, this is what their skews look like, and their parting tools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They look like this. So what can you surmise about an edge like that? It's not going to be smooth. It's like a little tomato knife. If you're roughing, who cares? No, it's okay for roughing, but I'm talking about if you were down into finishing land, trying to do better. What about its durability? It's going to break. It's going to break out there at a very minor level, but it ain't going to break off sharper. I mean, it's going to dull quicker. Here's the same tool that's been honed. So when you hone a tool, you see that little polishing line. The first time you do it, there'll be a little polishing line. So this is what the same edge looks like when you hone it. It's all about scratch sizes. That's what a 60, 80 grit scratch off a grinder looks like. That's what 600 scratches look like off a 600 grit hone. Turns out we don't need to really go beyond 600. Carvers need to. We don't, because of the amount of wood that we remove. 600 is as far as I ever find I need to take a turning tool. Okay, 600 grit. Since he did bring up a scraper, We did another study, it was published in the English magazine, of this is what scrapers look like, how most people use them off a grinder. Frank Payne wrote a great book in the late 50s called The Practical Woodturner. This guy stood at a lathe for over 50 years in High Wycombe, England. A lot of wisdom in that book. People don't even pay much attention to that book. A lot of wisdom in that old book. That's a classic. Now, he's not a great writer or anything. You got to bear with him. He was a woodturner, probably not highly educated to any large extent, but he stood at a lathe for over 50 years, and there's a lot going on. He theorized in the 50s that those burrs that are produced on a scraper are melted on. I don't think he's too far off the mark. It looks like an arc welder produced it, didn't it? I only use this to start with and where I'm going to rough with, but this is what I use. And it's in all the old books. You find it in books in the 19th century. Frank Payne talks about it. It's a burnish burr, not a burr off the grinder. That's where you start, but we burnish the burrs. And we control the size of the burr and the types of burrs by how much pressure we use. Can't do that with a grinder, turns out. So a burnish burr. And what I use is a piece of carbide is the burnisher. Anyway, he did mention scrapers, but that's another story. Another story. Until they're dull. I'm trying to get with the spirit of the group here now that I'm learning how you operate here. I can use it for anything. That's the one thing you can do. I didn't know we were going to do scrapers, but shoot, why not? Why not? Just a slight diversion here. Okay. You have to start at the grinder. You always start at the grinder. Okay. The cabinet maker has a scraper blade. They have to start with it filed in stone to produce sharp corners. Okay, and then they burnish the burr. Now, we erase the burr with a hone off the grinder, and now here's what is different. This is carbide. I'm going to tip it only 5 degrees towards the top. But how hard I push down is based on what do I want to do with it. If I'm removing bark on a bowl, I don't want to sacrifice a sharp edge on a bowl gouge, sacrifice a burr, so there I pull up a pretty heavy burr. That's giant to me, okay? But if I'm doing finishing work, and the best finish I still have yet to, I've never seen it topped, and Del Stubbs did the first video ever, actually in woodworking, I think, commercially, in wood turning. His finishes were, you know what he did? He did burnished burrs. Better than any bowl gouge will ever do. Because he found just rubbing the bevel, especially on his thin pieces, it deformed the piece. You do better with a burr. But you have to remove the burr that was there completely, and then just use, I caught it, 1,300 miles with a headwind for 1,000 miles of it, I tell you. So here, it's how hard I push down, see? And that was just a little bit. That's a finishing burr. So do I get these tools back? I'm going to have to do an inventory. But don't run your finger along it. Now, you did ask a good question, but there really is only one answer. It's whenever I'm no longer producing either a good surface or the shavings are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and that tells me that it's dulling. The better the steel, the longer the burr. If you have an old carbon steel scraper, it hardly will hold the burr more than a minute or so in many woods. If I've got a M2 high-speed steel, it's going to last longer. Then I have to get into these exotic steels like powdered metal M4, A11, D15, 2030, 2060. They're high-wear steel, so guess what? The burr stays on a long time. So the real answer is note when it's starting to dull and don't screw around. Pull up a new burr. But I can, with a burnisher, produce large burrs, medium burrs, and finished burrs. How big did that feel? And that's a big one. Still, this professor, PhD in metallurgy from MIT at Crucible Steel, he measured those burrs, and he said some of the burrs I was pulling up were only 4 thousandths of an inch tall, but you know what? The human hand can feel it. That's the mystery of the human hand. It can feel 4,000ths and 5,000ths. He couldn't believe it. But yet he had to admit there was a burr there. But that's for finishing. Very fine finishing. But it'll give you better than any bowl gouge if you learn how to do it. But it's also shear scraping, which is a different animal too. But with those kind of burrs, because look at what you've got. You don't have this raggedy looking thing. What you've got is a piece of steel. It's been folded up just a tiny amount. And it acts like a little bitty cutter. It's what it really does. It's a scraper, but that's all the difference in the world. If you take the class Sunday on turn-lidded boxes, I'm going to teach them how to do finishing work with a scraper. I'll show how to do it with a hook tool too, but a lot of times I do just as good or better with shear scraping with fine burrs. Thought they were a clumsy tool. They can be. They can be a crutch. You can develop horrible habits with a scraper if you're not careful, but if you learn them as a refined tool, they're fantastic. They are fantastic, but it's a whole other animal. Okay, back to the Mr. Skew here. So how do we prevent a dig-in? Use a bigger skew. It's more clearance. What do you think the advantage of dig-ins, this grind versus this grind? You see where there'd be any difference in the number of dig-ins? Which would be more likely to catch, this one or this one? Yeah, why? I think that's the origin of the grind, to be honest with you. It's pushed back and down. It's back out of the way. But when you're planing with a traditional skew, that long point is lurking right over the wood. You're very close to a dig-in if you don't pay attention. Here's another way to put it. This one doesn't tell me where to cut. This one tells me where to cut. If you cut where it's a curve, you cannot get a dig-in. You can get a run back, but you cannot get a dig-in. I really think that's part of the origin of this grind. It was a big safety valve. So if you're doing production work, you came in from a hard night of drinking the next day, all you had to do was just keep it in the curve area and you're going to be okay. This one, you better pay attention. You better pay attention. If you're going to learn one cut with a skew, learn this one. Let me see if I got a parting tool. Does everybody know what a parting tool does to the end grain? See, it looks like am I doing that right? Isn't that pretty? That looks like a hay bale. Looks like a hay bale, doesn't it? Hope I didn't make anybody mad yet. We're back to surface decoration. They sell parting tools that have two flutes. They show different grinds. Everybody's trying to avoid the skew chisel. But you know what? Learn the skew chisel. These are horrible sounds. I don't know. Oh, is that sandable? Did you see what I showed you? Don't some of you bolt turners have 20 grit paper? I heard they sell a lot. Okay, how much sanding? Oh, I can't. There we go. Think we need much sanding? Are you sure you're going to miss it? You ready? What do you got in your hand there? Ooh. Did the big bottle come back? Have we counted them? Okay, we're watching. Okay, how much sanding are we going to have to do on that now? Let me see it again. God. No, go ahead. Boy, she's tough. Golly. No, but you go from something that's really unsandable, the torn end grain like that. In reality, there should be no sanding. You can get it where you don't have to sand with that at all. And it's called the shoulder cut. When I tried to learn that on my own, it took me probably 9 months to a year because there's a real subtlety to it. You can't take much wood, and you can't this trailing part of the tool away just a few degrees. The more you open it up, the worse the cut. The smaller you have it, the better the cut, but you're right at the verge of disaster. That's one of the things old Frank Payne said. Some of the best cuts in wood turning are right at the edge of disaster. This is one of those cuts. Because if you lose that, it's called the clearance angle. It's ugly. And I skipped it. It has a violence to it. You'll see what it did? It rips into the end grain up and down. Technically, that's not a dig in. That's a run back. But that's from losing the clearance angle. But boy, if you do that with a spur and a dry, it's got a kick. It'll scare you. Well, it's not going to hurt you physically, but it'll scare you. So you can't take much wood. I'm lining up the point with the back of the bevel. As soon as I get into the wood, what I'm doing, I'm canting it over a few degrees. The moment I do that, there's a little black shadow between the steel and the wood, and that's what I watch. The smaller it is, the better the cut. So you play with that. When you're new, you open it up a little bit. As you get more bold, get it down to under 5 degrees. Good news is you can see it. You can actually see it. You just skim the wood. You can't take much wood at all. If you try to take too much wood, it'll just stall on you. So it's a finishing cut. So you often do 3 cuts where you wish you could do 1 and be done, but you're trading sanding time for turning time. They're never equal. So learn this cut. Very, very important cut. Even some of the old pattern makers' books where they use primarily scrapers, this is the one place they would use a cutting tool like a Skew to face off the end grain because it does it so cleanly. It's just, that's one of the names of it. It's an end grain facing cut. Any of you part off with a parting tool? Sounds like it ought to be a good tool. It's not a good tool for parting off. So learn to part off with a Skew. Here's how you do it. Let's say this is the end of a tool handle or something. Okay? That's what we're making, a long tool handle. And that's the end of it. So here's how you part off with a Skew. It's just a series of V-cuts. And what happens with a parting tool, if you're not careful, just before you punch through, it'll snap the fibers, twist them, and it'll leave a hole in the end of your project. The reason is this keeps rotating. So with a Skew chisel, what I'm going to do, my last V-cut is into it and stops this from rotating. So back off some pressure. Move your tool rest at an angle just in case it comes back a little bit. Always give yourself some clearance. Now I'm just about ready to punch through, and I'm going to come at it like this. There. I got a little bit of a hole there. I broke it off myself. Let me do it again. I pushed on it at the end. That wasn't good. Then you can also practice this. Just do it over. I'll get it right this time. Lathe doesn't like me. There we go. So no hole. Leave a little bitty nub, and that's my finish work. So part off with it. What I'm using is a V-cut for the shoulder cut and that particular cut. And one thing about these kind of drive centers, you don't just bring up the tailstock. If you were here beforehand, what you saw me do was this. You take a dead blow mallet and you drive it into the end grain. That didn't sound good. You have to do this. Mark your centers and hit it hard. Then take it off. Okay? Believe it or not, in Japan, they use, it's a ring center is what we've got. They do pieces this long with no tailstock, and all they're using is a little bit bigger version of this driven into the end grain. It's like, that can't work. It does work. They hadn't discovered the tailstock in their traditional turning. So With robust, I showed him some real Japanese ring chucks, and he threads his so you can make little chucks, tap them with 3/4 tin. He said, well, instead of making a whole chuck, I'll just make a ring that threads on there like this. Now what you've got is a ring center. You do it between centers, though. You don't do like the Japanese do, and you can even rough turn a bowl with that. If you want to put notches in it, you can too. That's just a big version of this. That looks like reverse. This lathe doesn't like me, maybe. There we go. Oh, I had my arm under it there. So this is the V-cut, straight V-cuts and angle V-cuts. These are angle V-cuts, straight V-cuts. Doesn't look like much, pretty important, because it's the foundation for about 5 different cuts. We can use it to lay out beads. We'll also use it for this. This is something I do in a lot of my work. I didn't really bring out my work, got here a little late, but I do little bitty beads on a lot of my work, and I do it with a skew like this. Now if I want to reveal it, I plane up to it like this with a short point. This is a revealed little bead. And then this is something called shadowing. I come in underneath it and just touch it so there's a black line like that. Take a little sandpaper and just remove the crown. You always get a little bit of crowning doing that technique. Then we get a perfect little bead. Try to roll a bead that small with a gouge. It's a little hard to do, but we get perfect little beads. I put them on a lot of my work, really of all sizes. Yeah, here's some. So here's a little micro bead at the back of this awl. I don't know if you can see it. Am I holding it wrong place? Towards something. There we go. You see it? Little bead. Little bead. Triplets. They look good as a mix. Uh-oh, other way. There it is. Or here. I got to hold still, don't I? I'm moving. He's moving. There we go. Little micro beads is a grouping or something. It just separates you from production work when you start doing work like that. Little tiny beads. I use them on a lot of boxes at the joint to separate. Surely there's a box here near the surface. Yeah, here we go. Tell me if I'm doing it right. So here I'm doing a bead at the joint. Then here I did a bead into the full end grain. You can do it into the full end grain. Hard to roll beads like that into full end grain. The skew will do it, though, just fine. Sometimes I put them on the bottom. Yeah, there's a little tiny one on the very bottom. Oop, which way? Here it is. Little bitty bead going around that guy. So it's a nice detail. I didn't put one up in the lid, but sometimes I do too. Okay, so those are just little micro beads, I call them. And then I shadow them. No matter what the scale is, I shadow my work. That's what production work can't really do, machines. Even $2 million machines can't do this little tuck undercut. And what that does, it gives definition to your work. That separates you from production work. Okay, it's not hard to do. Just touch at the base. Okay? Now, how are we doing on time? I don't have a clock. What time is it? Oh, we got time. I'll show you 2 hard cuts. Okay? These have been the easy ones. Let's look at a couple of hard ones. These things are called pommels. Pommels, where you leave a square. This is an old production turner's technique of doing 2 at a time. 2 handles. Cut it like that. Now you got a beautiful doorstop. that showed up around the world with Woodturners doing this. This is one of my favorite details. It's a microbead in the bottom of a cove. Lovely little detail. Again, you're not going to see that in production work. And there I did 3 of those little beads together like that. But the main thing is the pommel. The pommel. It's an excellent exercise in turning a lot of air, is what you're doing. So the first thing you want to do is start with a square, not a parallelogram, and center it. You know, I actually center them pretty well by just marking corner to corner with an awl, not a pencil, but with an awl. I can do a lot better than if I had a pencil, because it follows the edge quite well. This is a very common detail in furniture and architectural turning. There's kind of 3 flavors. There's a square-shouldered, a rounded, and a lamb's tongue. Skew does all 3 very nicely. I live in a part of the country where there's more Victorian houses where people are still living in them than anywhere in the world. And that kind of turning is endless for the Woodturners. Endless, if you want to do it. Problem is, the group up around where I live, they all want to do bowls and vessels. Architectural turning is a whole other universe. So let me check this end, how well I've centered it. Here's how you do it. Just barely put it into the wood. Nick into it, into what is going to be waste. 1, 2, okay, that's a little high. Tap it down, go in a little deeper, test it. 1, 2, 3, oops, still a little high, right there. Same place, thought I moved it. One, 2, 3, 4. They look pretty much the same. So a wood turner, that's centered. That's not machinist centered. That's very, very close. Now you can drive it home. Now if I'm doing production work, I found the center here. I can put a little brad in it, put it on a piece of plywood, hammer it in, tack down a strip this way and this way, remove it, put the nail there. Now all your stock will be centered. Just you made a jig to center all your stock. Because seldom do you make one of these. You're going to make multiples. So here's the pommel cut. 2 flavors, or the common ones. A square-shouldered. So let's say it's going to be right in here. This is a square-shouldered. I always begin all of them with a square-shouldered pommel. Plane up to it. Should be it. There we go. There's a square-shouldered pommel. Could go just a tiny bit deeper here, it looks like. Just a little deeper. There we go. So the goal is not to break off your corners. And no sanding. These you can't sand. Your fingers would get beaten up. So the goal is there's no sanding on the end grain and the corners are intact. I don't like these kind of pommels because they get chipped easily and they look too abrupt. So here's what I normally do on ones I get to design. This is a rounded pommel. And you get a nice arch. If you look at ones from Home Depot and places where they've sanded them, the leading edge sands more than the trailing edge. You get what's called a smear. Good hand turning, you get this archway, very clean. You're not going to get that for machine turning. So there's a place for hand turning. We can't do it faster or cheaper, but you know what we can do is better. Okay? That's what's called a paint grade. Paint grade. when people bring you this kind of work, you ask, is it a paint grade or a finish grade? Here's a finish grade. Little bitty line. Get him one more time. There we go. There's a good finish grade. No sanding or anything on that one. Paint grade, they're going to paint it, so you don't have to take it this far. Difference is a paint grade, I lead with a point. Finish grade, I start with a point, then I move to the area right above the point. It's the only difference. Ooh, this one I dropped. Okay, good. So what's he doing? I was going to show you, not everything on the lathe turned is round. There's a square veneer size pummel. Why would you do that? Just an exercise, just practicing. So there, that was turned on the lathe, but it's not round. Is that possible? Of course it is. One last cut. Yes, sir. We very seldom make finished pieces in wet wood, long grain. Don't fool yourself. Do it in dry wood. It'll fool you. It'll tell you you're better than you really are. So it's kind of the ethics of being a wood turner, isn't it? No. Poplar is one of the best practice woods I can think of. Poplar. Kiln-dried poplar is fantastic. Seldom is there a knot. It's almost all usable. If you can't afford it, get some 2x4s, rip them in half, practice on that. If you can do shoulder cuts, pommels, and that wood, you can do it in anything because it's crap wood. And it means you got to have a sharper tool and a better technique to cut that than if you were working cherry or something like that. So don't be easy on yourself. Be hard on yourself if you want to get good at this. But you're going to have to practice. So here's, and I really did land my little guy on the floor. Ooh, did I ever. Let's see if we can fix him without grinding him. This is probably one of the hardest cuts in wood turning, and people come to it prematurely. You want to come to this cut last with a skew, and you want to go to a smaller skew. So just in 2 passes, you can roll a bead with a skew. Now, that's a very hard way to do a bead. So here's how I advocate you learn it. This is a slower way of doing it. Go ahead and lay it out with V-cuts. Then take a pencil and smear across the center. It's not a center line. Stay out of that. And here's how I'm going to do it that's different. Roll and roll, roll. This tool's just a little dull, but that's the idea. You actually take the short point and put it into the wood. It took me 2 cuts to roll that bead. This one took me 6 layout cuts and 2 per side. That's a total of 10 cuts. But it gives you more control, because here's the problem with the rolling cut if you try to do it. This is not using the point in the wood. Beautiful finish, though. Look at the shavings that are coming off. When you see those kind of screw noodles, you know it's a good cut. And it just polishes off the end grain beautifully. But here's the problem. It's very easy to get this. That. Mark of Zorro, we call that. Like that. Does that look familiar? Surface texture. Everybody. Come to this cut last of all. Learn all the other cuts first, okay? This one you're going to have to practice a lot. Here's how you practice it, okay? Don't do beads or anything round to begin with. Just go to the end of a cylinder. Let's pretend this is the end of our cylinder. Close enough. So what you want to do is take the point and put into the wood and practice this. Slow it down. Don't need that speed. And just practice this. And then go to the other side and just practice it. If it turns out one side is harder than the other, do a whole cylinder of just that side. And then come back and put beads together like 1 inch wide. But you're going to have to learn to get that kind of control with your point. Seems odd, but we're using the short point as our friend. Here's why. Here's the mystery of this cut. When I'm rolling to the right, you don't know this, but I'm pushing it back to the left a little bit. When I roll left, I'm pushing back to the right a little bit. They don't tell you that in any book. It's because if I don't keep that little bit of side pressure of the bevel on there, you'll get a Zorro virtually every time. Very frustrating cut. So have a sense of humor when you're learning this cut, and don't be hard on yourself. The ultimate thing to make, see if I can put my hands on one. I think I can. Is to do these. Turn eggs. That sounds like Aliens, the movie. It's going to blow up. If you can do an egg with this tool, your bowls will look better, your handles will look better, your wall pieces that are turned will look better. Why? Why would this be a great exercise of learning form and tool control both? There's 4 curves on here. It's asymmetrical. If you don't get all 4 working together, it doesn't look very convincing. It's a challenge. It's a complete challenge. So you're taking a difficult tool, probably the most difficult cut with the tool, you're doing a very difficult form. But there's a problem. If you do these between centers, what do you see as the drawback if you did these between centers? Both ends. They never look very good. And I don't want to see you do it in a steel chuck. Anybody know why that's not a desirable way? If you get a run back into that steel chuck, there'll probably be a piece about you in the newsletter. No, here's how I turn them. Turn them like this. Turn a number 2 Morris taper out of a piece of wood. Drive that into the headstock. Leave this extra. You know what that is? That's my backstop. If I get a run back, it's going to hit that. It's not going to hit the threads. And also, the strength of this is not the tenon like on a Morris taper. It's this little shoulder right here. So that shoulder has actually been concave to sit on top of my threads. Now you have full access to the egg. You'll finish off this end, and then you part this down with a series of V-cuts, continue your curve. That's still the way I do them. I own every chuck known to mankind. I still use this method, but here's what I do. I make up a little jig of a number 2 Morris taper so that when I make it, I can use that to just test it. Then drive it into the headstock, okay? So the way you make a jig for your lathe, because Morris tapers don't seat at the same point on every lathe. Hate to tell you that. So put in your center, put a mark on it where it bottoms out. Take that center, piece of plywood is best. Put one vertical, have an edge where it's flush with the edge. Now take this, hang it off, put it right at the edge, now glue in your other piece. Like that. Now you've just made a jig for your lathe, where it's going to bottom out on your lathe. Okay? And use that as a test. If you make it a little too small, the way a taper works, just back up 1/4 of an inch. Everything will get bigger. So you don't have to cut it off and say, I'm a failure. If it's too big, you can't drive it in. There's a limit to how far you should try to drive it. If it won't go, take it out. Remember, if you have this kind of center, you can always, it'll be recentered. Just go right back on it. That's probably the best exercise I ever found to teach people form in the eye, but tool control with a skew, because it's all rolling cuts. That's all it is. And I don't want to see them with big slashes in them. That's better if the eggs don't have them. I taught a class up in Boston a few years ago, and a fellow called me 6 months later and said, I took you literally every morning. I have coffee, I go turn an egg, and then I allow myself to have breakfast. I said, how are they looking? He said, now they look really good. For the first month or two, they look like crap. But you either get this or you don't. We're only talking about 2 to 5 minutes. I know, I didn't say what species. You might start with an ostrich egg and it'll be I know. I'm really thinking of the standard chicken egg, okay? Start with 8/4 material. But it's a lovely exercise to do with a skew. When I teach the week-long class, everybody has to do me a dozen before they can graduate. That's not very many. No, you either get it or you don't get it. Well, it's a challenge. And you got to have a real sense of humor doing eggs. Because everybody knows what an egg, I bring in real eggs for people to look at. It doesn't help. It's kind of a joke. Everybody knows what an egg's supposed to look like. But when you start trying to make it, it's like, uh-oh. But what happens, that'll transfer to everything you do, your bowls, your vessels, your handles. I don't care what it is with shape, because you'll start seeing the subtlety of that, asymmetrical. 4 curves, and there are 4. There's not 2, and they're not symmetrical. So, but it's a lovely shape. It is a very lovely shape. Is that enough? Yes, ma'am. I'm ready. This curve is different from that curve. They start at different points. The bottom is not a flat. People, when they make them, especially if this tends to be flattened, that's actually a continuation or a little bit different of a curve. They're also not pointy. That actually changes the radius as you get out on the end. Yep, they really are. Another thing to do is buy a dozen chicken eggs and lay them out on a towel, and pretty quickly you should be able to see there's no 2 eggs the same. They're all different. And the beauty of a chicken egg, there's no pretty grain like this to fool the eye, and you just see form. So when the wood is spinning, there is no pretty grain. I don't care if it's cocobolo, there is no pretty grain, because grain can fool the eye as to shape. See, that looks like an egg right there. That's just from the grain. That can fool the eye into seeing the shape. where a chicken egg is so bland, that's actually a positive. That'll help you in your turning. It'll help you with your turning. But I promise you, everything you make will start looking better if you see that subtlety. Okay? If you're taking a class with me while I'm here, go to alanlaser.info. I think they put that in the newsletter. There's articles on the Skew, lidded boxes, and there's handouts that relate to the classes. Please bring those handouts if you would. I've got a store. I had some body work done a few years ago where I was out for many months. So I have a catalog up here. I didn't really set up tonight to sell anything. They said I could, but I really didn't. But if you want to see what I have in my little store, I've got a lot of that stuff with me even. You can order online or come by when I'm here the next 3 days. Or a week from Saturday, I'm at the Fort Worth Club somewhere in Fort Worth, and my wife will be there helping me. I will be selling at that for sure. And I'll do an all-day demo of the Skew. I'll make a hook tool in that demo. I'll do a lidded box where I use the hook tool. I'll do a lot on scrapers. I'll do a lot more than we had our hour and a few minutes. I'll do more with the Skew. If you feel crazy, come take a week of the Skew with me in Indiana. I'll be at SWAT this year demonstrating, and also I have a trade show booth. If you're really insane, I'm demoing at the Irish National Conference outside of Dublin in October. If you feel like a trip to Ireland, it was the most fun conference I've ever been to years ago. It's wild. So come over to the old country. It's a lot of fun. Yes, sir. Yep. You got it. To the long point. It's a square. To the long point. Uh-huh. You got it. Start your curve about 1/3 to 1/4. Anybody know why I'm doing that? That's where the tip point changes and you'll get a dig in. If you stay out of that area, you're okay. You got it. It's 70 degrees from point to point. It's still 70 degrees. Don't lose that. If you pull this around too far, you can't find it. If you don't have it far enough, it's trailing too close to the wood, you'll get more runbacks and dig-ins. So the 70 degrees is still operative, even though it's a curve. You got it. It's straight and then a curve. If you get my little catalog, I had them put in a picture that I use. That's one of the best pictures I've ever had of a Skew. We just put it in as a filler. No, go back to the first page, behind the cover. Behind the cover. See that? That Skew in the bottom right. That one. See that? That's perfect. That shows it very nicely. Like that. Any other questions before I... Yes, sir. Sure. Yeah, I'd use scrapers on the alabaster. It's so nasty. And borrow somebody else's lathe. Don't even do it in your own shop. That's my advice. I do turn. You'll have to come up. I've got an outdoor shop. I live in Wisconsin. And we hit 30 below here in January. And I have an outdoor shop where I turn frozen Jell-O and ice. And on that, I use a Skew. Now, if you could find me a walk-in freezer, I could demonstrate that in Texas. But you have to come up in winter and turn with me when I turn frozen Jell-O. See, it turns out Jell-O at 0 is too rubbery. You got to hit 10 below or colder. What do we do with those long nights up north? But anyway, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, if we could give Alan some time to clean up before we come up and ask questions.